Hi everyone. So yeah, I'm Bashori. I'm the lead scientist here at UK NEQAS for the Haemoglobinopathies program. So today I'm just going to give an update on our DNA program, which obviously the majority of you here today are participants in. I've packed a lot into this talk, so I'll try and keep it within time. So bear with me if I seem to be rushing a couple of the slides. So I'm going to be covering today just a couple of updates that we've kind of had developments on in the last year. So I'll be talking about the survey material that we use in the program. I'll be talking about our new online platform, which should be familiar to all of you now, which is the website that we went live with earlier this year for returning results. We also updated our recommendations, so the comment codes that you use in your result submission have changed this year. And also last year, after the webinar that we did, I sent out a survey, and I'll just go through a couple of the results from the survey last year as well. So to start with our survey material, so I'm sure you are all pretty much familiar now, but we are currently using survey material from two different sources. So historically, we've been using DNA that is surplus from patient samples that is very kindly provided to us from the Leiden Medical Centre by Dr. Harteveld. And we are still doing that. But we are also looking to move to using DNA from that has been extracted from cultured cell lines. And I'm sure I've touched on this briefly in previous talks, but just as a reminder, we are looking to do that because we do envisage it's a long-term, a good way of having a long-term source of DNA. And so with that in mind, we are in the process now of building a library of cultured cell line cases. This process is a slow one because we do, it requires help from clinicians who can arrange blood to be taken from willing donors. And that is generally how we are going forward with it. So, it's not going to be kind of built overnight, but we are getting there slowly. Oops. So currently, we've got 24 cases in our library. At the moment, only 8 of them are actually ready and available for use as survey material, and the rest are pending. And that's just because culturing of cell lines takes months to kind of get them to a stage where the DNA can be extracted from them. But the good thing is once we have them in the library, it's kind of an unlimited source of DNA eventually. So the idea is just to build as many cases as possible in the library for now, which can mean we can tap into at any point in the future. And obviously we're also working on building a range of different cases as well. So the cases are stored at Manchester Cell Bank. That's who we're doing this project with. And so far we've sent out 3 surveys, which included a cell line sample. And generally we find that the DNA extracted from these cultured cells is of a higher quality and concentration. So it definitely is worthwhile. So moving on to our new online platform. So we've been talking about developing this for a while. So we were really happy to finally make that change this year. So the website went live at the previous survey, which was 2302DN, and that went out in June of this year. And it was as successful as I could have hoped. I was really happy with it. We had 48 out of 49 participants submitting their results through the website. And there were no major issues with the submission reported, and we generally got positive feedback, and it was really good. And of course, it's a new platform, so there are certain areas that we're still working to improve on. And there was a feedback section within and there still is for the next survey that's out there. So I do encourage our participants to use that if they can. But the feedback that we got in the previous survey, some of the things that were mentioned were it's a very useful and easy to use platform. It's a really nice idea to have a computerized way of returning the results, user-friendly, clear, easy to navigate. The functionality is excellent and easy to handle. And then one said the website overall worked well, although I did have trouble inserting the traditional legacy nomenclature for one of the globin variants, and the format did not look correct. Some of the kind of more critical feedback, which is fine, was that the entry of the legacy nomenclature is complicated and unnecessary. It's not clear what is meant to be written in each section, even with the instructions provided. We did try to give prompts and provide instructions, so I'll review that and see if we can improve on that more. Also a comment about the PDF report submission. So this is the section where you upload your lab report. Simultaneous submission of 2 or more reports should be allowed. We are working on that, and it has been considered as a potential improvement. So I can't remember where we're at yet, whether we managed to do it yet or not, but do look out for that. That might be a change in the future. I think the alpha and beta globin genotype results box could be improved because using scripts is not intuitive. So we are aware that the main issue at the moment is with, I think, this section of the results page. And in all fairness, when we were designing this, well, not we, when our IT team were designing this website, they did show this function to me, and there was a reason why we had to go with this option. And so I've listed some of them here. So generally, because of the use of the Greek letters in our DNA nomenclature, it is quite challenging to capture that as data. And, I'm sure, as you're all aware, the standard QWERTY board doesn't have a key for Greek letters. So it's not easy to just type it through your keyboard. And that's the reason why we had to kind of go through with this a bit of convoluted way of entering this result. Equally, copy and paste is not supported. And that's kind of something to do with the coding of the website built in to there. So it's a bit tricky for that reason. And we can't offer a drop-down box. And, that's for obvious reasons. We would like it to remain a free text option. If we offer a drop-down box, then it gives participants, an option to choose something that's already been written in. And, we want to see how you write the nomenclature. We don't want to give you a selection that you choose from, because it would defeat the whole purpose of this. And so we're also, trying to capture the data in a way that it's actually easy to download, to analyze and score for the reporting stage. So all of those things, considering all of those things, that's why this ended up being the best way at the moment for entering the nomenclature. So do bear with us, if we do find a way to move away from it and have a more user-friendly way of entering the results, we will get there. But currently this is where we're at. So I hope that you can eventually get used to it and find a way to submit your results easily. So future developments with the online platform. As I said, we are, with every survey that goes out, we're making minor improvements. Even between the last survey and this survey, we have made a couple of minor improvements in the background, which should make it easier going forward for us and for you guys. But eventually, we're also looking to then automate the report side of things. So obviously, currently, we are writing the summary report that we email out or previously emailed out to you, but hopefully we will find a way to generate that from the website directly, and also the performance assessment side of things. So for those of you who are registered on any other UK NEQAS surveys, you'll know that we generate a report automatically, and it kind of shows your performance assessment within a summary report. It's not separate. So we are hoping that maybe one day we can get to that kind of a report as well, and having the performance assessment all online as well, so you can just log into your website account and see it there without us having to email anything or upload it. Currently, we were still uploading the report to the website. So eventually, we hope that we can just have it on there automatically. So these are more long-term projects, so we will have to see where at what point can we move to that, but it's a longer term. Those are the next steps. So the new recommendations. So we had been planning to revamp our recommendation comment codes for a while. We did find that some of them had become a bit outdated or didn't quite capture all the different recommendations that there were out there. So I've listed the new ones here, but just as a reminder, these are the old recommendations. And they were they were okay, but we did have some feedback over the years about how they probably could do with a revamp. So within the new ones, we've kind of things like we've removed use of the term partner. We've changed it to baby's biological father, which is the term that is more appropriate and recommended by the antenatal screening program here in the UK as well. We've changed genetic counselling to reproductive counselling. We've also kind of we have merged the two, so we had parental testing is recommended and testing of other family members. We've kind of merged that into one comment now. And we've also included some newer comments, things like testing of the gamma and or delta globin genes is recommended, which I think previously wasn't an option that could be used. And then also further molecular testing is recommended due to the method limitations of this laboratory. I think that's a useful one to have in there, because obviously we are aware that many labs do targeted testing according to their local communities, and you are aware of the limitations that your assays would have. So this could be a comment that you use to make it clear that you're aware that you do have limitations within your testing remit. So I would recommend you use that code for that. And I think the others are quite familiar as well. So, but it was just a really good way to revamp the recommendations, and hopefully these ones are a bit more useful going forward. So the last part I just want to cover is about the participant survey that I sent out last year. I think it was very useful for us, and also for you to just kind of give us your opinions. So it included 12 questions, and we sent it out after the webinar last year, and I received 24 responses. So one of the questions was about, sorry, the top of my panel is covering the question, but so whether the number of distributions is the number of distributions that we send out per year is right, is enough. So generally we found that the majority of participants who responded feel that 3 distributions per year is just about right. Only a few of you feel that 3 is difficult to manage. And nobody wants more than 3 distributions, which is probably fine, because I think we'd struggle ourselves to send out more than 3 distributions anyway. So that was helpful. So I asked whether you feel the time frame of 6 weeks is sufficient for doing the molecular testing. So our standard time frame is 6 weeks, but sometimes we do extend that to about 8 weeks, and we tend to do that over kind of summer period and Christmas period, because we are aware of certain countries having different staffing issues and things over those periods. So we try to consider that and take that in mind. And generally, yes, majority of people went with the 8 weeks is better during some periods. So it's good to know that we don't need to change the time frame for any reason. I also asked about whether the quantity of DNA that we send out is sufficient. And yeah, the majority of people did agree that 100 or the 23 to 25 microliters that we send out is sufficient. I think going forward, as we move on to the cultured cell lines as well, it should be more than enough, because that's usually double the concentration as well. Or the cultured cell lines DNA is 200 nanograms per microliter, so that should be more than enough to work with. So it's really good to know that we don't have to worry about that. As we've mentioned previously, we are limited with our survey material, which is why we have to cap the number of participants at 50 at the moment. But as we move on to the cultured cell lines permanently in the future, we may be able to open the survey out to other participants and not have to cap it at 50. So that would be a good move to make. And then I also asked about what our participants are currently using in terms of nomenclature. Now, this is a very ongoing kind of conversation at the moment that we're having generally internally and with our other NEQAS centres as well. We've got obviously other centres that do molecular testing. So I just wanted to capture whether, you know, what our current participants are doing in terms of the nomenclature that they use for their, you know, their patient reporting. So as you can see, the majority are saying that you still use both legacy and HGBS nomenclature. And only a minority of you are using only HGBS nomenclature in your reports. So, you know, it's probably not something we're going to change anytime soon in terms of the scoring. You know, it's still an advisory score, as you all know, but we have been talking about whether we need to make that an actively assessed score, which means it would go towards your cumulative performance assessment. But yeah, considering that both the majority of our participants are still reporting in this way, you know, we'll probably keep things the same for a while. But just to be aware that this is a change that we may consider at some point. And so on that matter, I did ask about how participants would feel if the HGBS nomenclature was to become actively performance assessed. And this was interesting, actually. I think the majority of people actually said they feel it should be actively performance assessed. And I think that's probably a reflection of the fact that it is the current, you know, I'm sure Mel will cover this in her topic, but it's in her presentation, but it's the probably the, you know, the more accurate way of reporting. And it's obviously used in all genetic reporting, HGBS nomenclature. So it probably is something that we should all move to eventually. So it's good to kind of know that, you know, a number of participants do agree that it should start actively performance assessing it. So as I said, we are considering whether we should make this move, but you know, we won't kind of spring it on you. We will warn you in advance if that is a change we decide to make. And then I also asked whether you feel that whether the recommendations should be actively performance assessed as well. And this was the opposite, really. The majority said they prefer that this stays as an advisory score. So, you know, again, it may be something we decide to change, and in the future, depending on whether we feel it's appropriate, we might start to actively performance assess it. But it's good to know where our participants are at in terms of this, and, you know, we will always consider that before making any major changes. And then I also asked about just to get an opinion on how they feel about how you feel about the range of cases that we send out. You know, we do aim to cover a number of different case scenarios, so that, you know, people get access to you know, unique cases that you wouldn't necessarily come across every day. But at the same time, we want to make sure we're covering, you know, standard cases as well, like just, you know, simple carriers. So, you know, it was good to know that people feel that it's a good and diverse range of cases that we send out. So, and some people had a few comments, but I can't remember what they were at the moment. But yeah, please do feel free to answer this question when I send it out again, if you have any comments about any of this. And oh, so yeah, how I asked about how you feel about an updated list of recommendations. Obviously, I've now done that. But some people did say, or the majority actually, small majority said the recommendations were fine as they are. But then we did have quite a few of you saying that it could require some updating, and they did make some suggestions. So we took all of those on board, and we did make those changes, as I mentioned earlier. I also asked about whether the model answer that we send out after the server has closed is still useful. And luckily, the majority of you said yes. And just as a reminder, the reason we send this out is because we are aware that it does take a couple of weeks before we can get the report out to you and your performance assessment. So if we send out the model answer quickly, it just gives you a chance to check yourself whether you got the right answer before we have to officially contact you, and it gives you a chance to investigate if anything was awry before that. And so just on that, so I will be sending out another survey after this webinar as well. And I do really want to ask everyone to try and take some time to complete the survey, because it's a really good opportunity for you guys to have your say, and it's a really good opportunity for us to hear your thoughts as well. So as I said, you know, having that feedback from you, it does help us to make those decisions about whether we should start making certain changes and you know, updating things. And the more people respond, the more desirable the results are. So obviously only 24 of you submitted results last time. So it would be good to have, you know, all 50 participants responding. That way I know that I've captured everybody's kind of opinion. So if you could take some time to complete the survey when it comes out, I would really appreciate it. And that's it from me. So thank you for listening. I hope I didn't take too long.
So I'm going to be whizzing through a sort of summary of the different versions of legacy nomenclature and some examples of HGBS nomenclature as well. So why am I talking about nomenclature? So partly because it comes up as one of the errors, obviously, in the NEQAS schemes, partly because we're talking about changing the way that nomenclature is scored slightly, particularly in terms of HGBS. And at our sort of meetings where we talk about things, you know, committee meetings where we discuss matters such as this, we thought it might be useful for participants to have a bit more of a reference guide. So there is some information already on the website, but it might be good for people to have a bit more of examples of things that would be acceptable and not acceptable for the NEQAS scheme. So I've kind of drafted this presentation as a platform for the things that I want to consider including in the guide. And I would hope that this could be used partly as quick reference, partly to help training new starters. Because I remember when I started working on haemoglobinopathy, I had many years of experience in other genetic disorders, but I found some of the terminology quite baffling because I'd never come across a lot of the way that things were described in haemoglobinopathies. One other thing was that when I first started, our very first ISO UCAS inspection, we were kind of asked where our quality document was to help us devise legacy nomenclature for new novel variants that hadn't been described before. And we didn't have anything specifically written in any of our standard operating procedures. And when I looked, I found it quite difficult to track down something that summarized, you know, how you would go about creating legacy nomenclature. Obviously, there's lots of information online about HGBS nomenclature, but I couldn't find anything that was like that described all the elements of legacy nomenclature and how to put it together. So that was what I was hoping this guide might also provide for people. So I was intending to write this talk mostly about legacy nomenclature and HGBS nomenclature, but when I was thinking about all the things I didn't understand when I first started in haemoglobinopathies, there was actually a lot of not mutation nomenclature, but basic terminology that I didn't understand. So I thought I would start there by going right from the basics. I know this is things that everyone in this meeting probably already knows, so I'm not going to go through it in big detail, but you know, for example, there is different ways of spelling some of the key terms, and NEQAS is happy to accept both of the common spellings for these terms like thalassemia. Obviously, there's different ways of representing genes, so you can use the kind of official Hugo-based nomenclature, which is referenced by HGBS, and then there's Greek letters, and then there's kind of sort of writing them out, alpha 2 or whatever gene. And again, these different versions are accepted by NEQAS in the right places. And then there's different terminology for all the different tetramers of hemoglobin and how they vary. And then there's also ways of describing the post-translational modifications of those normal proteins. And then again, as I've already touched on, there's different terminology for describing gene names. And different tetramers. So now we're talking about kind of abnormal proteins, so hemoglobin variants. And obviously these started being named after letters, and then they ran out of letters, I think. So they started using place names, and some of them have both a letter and a place, because there's been multiple variants that have landed within a sort of particular window. And an important point to make here, something that's a bit different from other genetic teams or disorders that are reported through genetic labs, is that the sort of most universal way these days of talking about genetic changes is to use variants, because they wanted to move away from polymorphism and mutation, because polymorphism implies neutral, benign, and mutation implies pathogenic. And obviously sometimes you don't know when you find something, you know, which that applies to. But in the hemoglobinopathy world, because hemoglobinopathies came out of protein studies originally, the word variant specifically applies to a sort of protein variant, so something that you see on a gel or an HPLC machine that's running differently. So we recommend, to avoid confusion, that a different term, not the word variant, but a different phrase is used to describe DNA changes in the hemoglobin genes, especially if that change does not result in a protein structural change, so a thalassemia mutation, for example. So we're not worried particularly right now about what term you use, because I don't think that's standardized, but you know, we would recommend not using the word variant because it can cause confusion sometimes. So obviously there's different ways of talking. There's lots of different classifications of different types of thalassemia. One of the things that particularly confused me when I was starting off was that when you're talking about alpha thalassemia, some of the old nomenclature talked about alpha thal 1 and alpha thal 2, and I always felt that alpha thal 1 should be like an alpha plus deletion, which removed one copy of the gene and you still have an active copy, but apparently it's the other way around, and I've never been able to work out quite why that is. But anyway, I don't think most people are using that terminology now, but I'm trying to capture here as many different forms that you might come across when you're looking for evidence in papers, for example, for your different variants or mutations. So obviously we've talked already about legacy nomenclature and HGBS nomenclature, and the fact that they both have, there's different formats for both. So there's more, the HGBS is more prescripted, but there's still sort of short and long forms that you can use. Whereas for legacy nomenclature, there's lots of different formats that have been used by different labs at different points. So, and as Bashori mentioned in her presentation, most people are still using a combination of legacy and HGBS nomenclature, because the health professionals working in this field are often not clinical geneticists, they're hematologists, they're midwives, and they've been accustomed to using the legacy nomenclature. So for that reason, to make it easier for, you know, the referring professionals to understand, it's common to still use legacy nomenclature, even though many other types of genetic disorders reports wouldn't. I think most of them have moved away from legacy nomenclature, but in the hemoglobinopathy field, it's still very commonly used. So this table is just comparing legacy nomenclature and HGBS nomenclature, so providing some examples of how you would report a change in a genomic sequence. How would you report a change in a sort of transcript, you know, transcribed area? both within the coding region and the non-coding region. So I'm not going to go through that now. I'm sure most people are aware of it. But again, like I said, I'm just trying to capture all the things that someone new might need to know when they're starting out in the field. So deletions can be problematic as well. So originally they were given sort of names according to how big they were, or where they, what population they were found in, or what the associated phenotype was. Just as a side point, some of the sizes have turned out to be inaccurate. So if we talk about the 20.5 deletion now in our reports, we don't put 20.5 kb because it's subsequently been found to not be 20.5 kb. So we sort of use 20.5 as a name rather than a size for the deletion. Some of the deletions create fusion genes, some of the duplications do as well, which are less commonly seen, but that's worth bearing in mind. Historic terminology sometimes refers to rightward or leftward deletions for alpha plus. So again, I've just added that in case anyone is unsure and wants a reference to sort of work out which one's which. Duplications are sometimes called anti, the name of the reciprocal deletion that would have been created at the same time. So the ones we most commonly see are anti-Lepore or anti-3.7. So those are both duplications of the same region that's deleted in the most common version. So duplications at the alpha globin locus are typically called triplications because you end up with 3 copies of the alpha globin gene on one allele. And that can get a bit complicated sometimes. But what's even more complicated is HGVS format for deletions, which is why we don't ask that as part of the scheme currently. And as far as I'm aware, it's not commonly being used for other disorders either, because it's sort of not that helpful to the clinician. It doesn't make it obvious what the impact will be or anything, or even which genes are involved always. The main reason for it is if the information goes to a different lab who might be doing a family test and they want to make sure that they're testing for the right deletion with the right probes or whatever assay they're using. So that's the sort of main aim of the HGBS type nomenclature, and currently it's not really applicable to the kind of information we're trying to get out of the scheme participants. So that's why it's not currently being used. So there's also different ways of describing the protein changes as well as the DNA changes. I'm not going to go through these right now, but I would stress that because we're doing genetic testing on the DNA, it's important that we report the DNA changes and not just the protein changes, because we haven't, unless you're doing mass spectrometry or something like that, you haven't actually detected the protein change. You're just predicting that that's what will happen. So it's important to always give the DNA change. Yes, and because of that reason, the protein nomenclature is not sort of strictly assessed during the NEQAS scheme. So you can provide it if you want to, and it will be commented on if you've got something obviously wrong, but it's not being kind of actively looked for. So this is just another table talking not about nomenclature, not about numbering, but about how you show the change that's happened. So what the different symbols are, what the different placement of the numbers, things like that. Again, I'm not going to go through it now. I was just trying to kind of capture the differences. So we've talked so far about numbering and about changes, but then you've got to kind of put everything together to come up with the final genotype. So, for example, in some cases, you might be able to work out if things are in cis or trans, and you've got to make sure that you're referencing the different genes that you found these changes in. So again, there's lots of different ways that you can do this. The NEQAS scheme asks for the information currently to be provided in legacy format, historical format, and in HGVS format. So for both of those, I've given two examples. So for the legacy nomenclature, you can have, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the shorthand legacy is the kind of the format which is has been used, I think, for most people up. So providing the Greek numbering and then the superscript to provide the information on the specific mutation. But you can also write it out. So this is another possibility for people, because we've certainly found at times that we can't use the Greek letters as part of the IT systems that we've used. So we've had to kind of write things out differently for our reports. And then it felt like we were generating the Greek, you know, the kind of the traditional legacy format just for the NEQAS reports, which isn't really the point of NEQAS. You know, it's supposed to be assessing what you actually do and for real life samples. So I just wanted to mention that that's an alternative for people who might be having those kind of issues. And it sounds like it might help with the web entry as well, but we might have to check how many characters we can get in the box, because obviously the longhand way of writing it can get quite lengthy. Although in that example, I provided the beta and the alpha, which you split up into different boxes, I think, for the scheme entry. And then HGVS, you can kind of write the alleles separated by semicolons, or you can sort of use a bit more of a longhand way and sort of put the HGVS names into a bit more of a sentence, as it were, to describe the different changes. So for the legacy nomenclature, as I've said, there are lots of possible formats, and NEQAS don't specifically, they don't say exactly which format you need to use, as long as it clearly indicates the mutations and any normal results that might be relevant, and that it's clear and easy to understand and it's unambiguous. And yeah, the other thing just to say is that if you're using this shorthand legacy nomenclature, you need to make sure that it's specific and reflects the actual mutation name, not the sort of outcome. So this red bit where I've said you shouldn't be using like beta plus beta 0, because although that might reflect the kind of phenotype, you know, the phenotypic outcome for the patient, it doesn't describe the actual mutations that you found. And then this slide again was just to talk about, or to try and capture different terminology really for describing phenotypes of patients. So carrier or trait phenotypes, and then disease phenotypes. Because again, some of these I didn't understand what HBH was, for example, when I started in haemoglobinopathies. So I thought it was worth briefly capturing that information. And the only thing I wanted to say here in respect to the NEQAS scheme is just a reminder to make sure that you always correlate the genotype that you've identified with the referral information provided by the scheme, because if the two don't match well, then you might need to recommend other testing, for example, or even possibly rethink about the results that you've got and whether you need to do any retesting or anything like that. So just as a summary, these are kind of a few things to mention as I've been going through. So things that you should do are when use websites. So there's two common websites that provide legacy and HGVS nomenclature. So it's a good idea to refer to those to make sure that you're getting them right. But also you've got to understand the kind of foundation of how those how those nomenclatures have been put together, because you need to be able to spot it if the websites are incorrect, because they're not always being, double checked or anything. Some of them aren't always right, particularly with the HGBS nomenclature. There can be small errors that have been made on the websites. So it's good to refer to the websites, but you need to make sure that what you're using is right and don't just copy it blindly. So yeah, make sure that you understand the rules underpinning the formation of those, as I've said. We'd recommend that you're consistent in the format that you use for legacy nomenclature. So choose the way that you want to format the results and apply that consistently across your team, because that'll hopefully reduce the risk of there being mistakes, because everyone's applying the same rules to the same kind of variants or mutations. So the really important thing, and the thing that causes probably one of the most most common errors, is to blend legacy and HGBS nomenclature, and that can be dangerous because it can cause someone to think it's a completely different mutation, because the rules for both systems they can mimic each other to some extent. So yeah, it's important that you get those bits right and make sure that you're using the right terminology for legacy and the right terminology for the HGBS version. As I've said already, make sure that you include the DNA change in addition to any protein changes like the variant, hemoglobin variant. And do ensure that you've always provided enough information to clearly identify the change so that it's unambiguous. So a lot of the older papers sort of described a single nucleotide change because it is a single nucleotide, but if it's being described as part of a codon and the codon's got duplicated nucleotides as part of it, then saying that you've changed one is not specific enough, because it could be any one of those three in the example I provided, and those would all, could potentially give you different amino acids. So it's important to make sure that you give specific enough information. As I think is always emphasized, do make sure that you state your limitations, because often people who don't detect particular variants in the scheme don't get marked down because they've said, well, we wouldn't detect this mutation, so potentially, other investigations are recommended. If we move towards scoring HGBS nomenclature, it might become a requirement to quote accession numbers for reference sequences, because that normally would be something that would be important. But right now it's not being scored, so I'm not stressing that point particularly. And another thing to bear in mind for the alpha genotyping in the legacy nomenclature, you've got to remember that the alpha symbols are kind of the other way around from what you might intuitively think. So the HBA2, the alpha 2 gene mutations apply to the first alpha, and the HBA1 mutations apply to the second alpha. So that's quite easy, just a point that's quite easy to get mixed up with sometimes. And final point, if your results are normal, make sure that's clear on the form. Don't leave the box blank and assume that that means normal. You've got to make sure that the information is clear. Otherwise, that result could have just failed or something like that on your assay. It's not clear for the people marking the results. And that's it. If anyone has a look and thinks of any other completely different types of formats that I haven't covered, then please do let me know, because like I said, I'm trying to write this into a sort of guidance document rather than a presentation. So I'll be happy to include any other suggestions that people come up with.
Good day, everyone. I would like to discuss a few errors which are made during the last assessment. There's still one assessment going on, I will not talk about that one because I don't want to be a spoiler. But the first two have been distributed and discussed with you. And there are some, let's say, typical mistakes made which need some attention, maybe for, let's say, next survey. So to this year, there were 2 samples distributed in the first few months of the year. Well, we normally you get the case details provided. So in this case, you see the 2301 DN1 being the Albanian male and 2301 DN2 the female. There is some hematology given. Also, the results of the HPLC or capillary electrophoresis is given, and the reference ranges are indicated below, so that you can easily determine whether you have a anemia or microcytosis or hyperchromia. Of course, different labs use different methods, and not all are equally suitable to detect the requested variant. Of course, some laboratories also use more than one method, and this slide just gives an overview of the different systems used. So Sanger sequencing, MLPA, some labs use Vienna lab strips assays, which means that they have, of course, a selected number of mutations which can be detected. Some may use next generation sequencing, the gap PCR for common deletions. And for the beta genotyping, I think the number one is Sanger sequencing, but also MLPA and Vienna lab strips assays are used. So whether you are capable of detecting the variant which is present in the sample, which needs to be assessed or which is sent about, is of course method dependent. However, no penalties are given if the variant is missed due to the methods you use, because, well, some methods simply are not suitable to detect that particular, maybe in your population, very rare mutation. But it is very important to realize that you might have missed a mutation, especially in your reporting to the referring doctor. So important, know your limits, the limits of your methods, and report accordingly. Now let's check the one which was sent about in the beginning of this year. It's the male, 42 years old, Albanian origin, and the reason for a referral was that his partner is pregnant and beta zero thalassemia carrier. Well, this is the results provided. You can clearly see that he is so on the edge, microcytic, hypochromic, and also anemic. And you see also the DNA analysis which has been done. So this is the correct genotype and the interpretation that he is carrier of a beta plus thalassemia. Well, there are several problems which you may have encountered. First, the poly-A variant. The poly-A variant is not detected in your assay, maybe. That is because certain pre-selected variants are not included in your test. And this is a relatively rare mutation, so it might be not present on the assay. But still you have, let's say, the hematology. So from the hematology, which is quite borderline, you can suspect at least a beta thalassemia trait, which makes you realize that you might have missed the mutation and that you might, let's say, in your common practice, refer to another molecular lab for Sanger sequencing, for instance. Another problem which may occur with this particular case is the legacy annotation, because as it is indicated here with the beta superscript poly-A and then between brackets AAT-AAA to AAT-GAA is very lengthy. However, what we also saw were hybrids made of, let's say, legacy and HGVS annotation. And these are, well, these are really two different things. So don't try to merge them, because that might lead to confusion. If you look at the beta A and beta C, and then the HGVS annotation, that is C dot star 111 A to G, which is the HGVS annotation for this poly A mutation, well, actually that's something which is non-existing. So also please take care that it is specific enough. So beta A, beta poly A is not specific enough because it doesn't indicate the position. The actual position is indicated in between the brackets. Of course, you could argue and say, well, there's only one polyadenylation site mutation known in the beta gene. So what else could I mean? And that's true. However, time is progressing and we are still discovering new mutations. And I would not be surprised that in the near future we would find a poly A mutation in the beta gene, which is different from this one. So I think it's good to be very clear in where the mutation is located so that the physician is not confused. Where can you find this legacy annotation and the correct HGVS annotation? Well, there are two different websites which you could go to. This is Hemoglobin VAR and Ethernet. And let's check for this example. The Ethernet site, you can just Google it, or you can use the web address on the upper right, lower right, and then you come up to this Ethernet website where the HGVS annotation is given for this particular mutation, and also the, let's say, common name or legacy name, which you could use in the superscript for the beta. And if you go to the Hemoglobin VAR site, and for your information, in the Ethernet site, there is also a link to the Hemoglobin VAR site. You come to this page, and there you can see exactly the same information. So either at the mutation in the HGVS annotation or in the legacy. Right, there are some scoring items. First, of course, the alpha genotype results for the specimen. The beta genotype results, the interpretation, and the recommendations. Well, let's check first well, of course, you can always check the Hemoglobin VAR and Ethernet sites if you have found something for the proper annotation. Let's check the alpha genotype results for a particular specimen which has been sent about in the first half of this year, 2302DN1. Well, this case, there was a deletion found, and the deletion is called the MET2 deletion. You can either annotate that in superscript or just on the same line. That doesn't really matter. It is very clear that you mean the MET2. The HGVS annotation is not required for deletions, as Melanie, the previous speaker, has properly indicated. And that is because there are sometimes problems to understand what the deletion is, and there are also some irregularities between the websites. So Ethernet refers to the MET2 deletion as is indicated here. So there is a lot of brackets and a lot of lower bars indicating that there is some doubt about the exact location of the breakpoint. However, if you go to the Hemoglobin VAR site for the same MET2 deletion, you are referred to a very specific breakpoint area, which, is a little bit doubtful whether that is correct. We also had participants who called this deletion the Calabrian deletion, which is also correct, and this can be explained in the following way. If you go to the Ethernet site and you look at the Calabrian deletion, you get a reference which is completely wrong, because that refers to a totally different deletion, which is much larger than the Calabrian deletion. And if you go to the Hemoglobin VAR site, two papers are mentioned which describe the Calabrian deletion, but if you look up those papers, they do not describe the breakpoint. So why is the MET2 the same as the Calabrian? Well, that is, you can also look at this article describing the MET2 deletion. The breakpoint is just within two regions with alignment of several allele repeats. And let's say if you swap one allele repeat, it's the Dutch deletion, and if you have the other one, it's the MET2 deletion. Unfortunately, we didn't have the possibility to sequence the Calabrian deletion breakpoints, but from the description in the populations studied, it's very likely that the Calabrian deletion is identical to the MET2 deletion. At least both were okay, so they scored the full points. The beta genotype results are indicated or written as superscripts, and it's important to in legacy annotation to use this superscript in the traditional way. And if you do this for case 2302DN2, it would look like, as indicated in the slide, it's a homozygote IVS1 G2T. Of course, you also have to annotate the HGVS, and you could either mention, call that homozygote, and then HBB C.92 + 1 G2T, or indicate the two alleles. So HBB C. And then between square brackets, one allele, 92 + 1 G2T, and the other allele. And that is separated by the point comma. Beware of hybrid annotations, again, in this case, because C.92 + 1 G2T as superscript doesn't make sense. It even is confusing because if you put a superscript C, it could be interpreted as codon. And well, if you can appreciate this example, codon 39 and C.118, which would refer to codon 118, would be very, very confusing. So please stick to the HGVS annotation and separately the legacy annotation. The interpretation part, it's important to call it alpha plus thalassemia trait or carrier, which is the phenotype, or homozygote or compound heterozygote, and that is the genotype. It's also very important to put in the interpretation the plus and the 0 as an expression of the phenotype. And then, as Bashori already mentioned, the recommendations have recently been changed. These are the old ones. Now we have new ones, which are more, let's say, fitting the purpose. And I would like to draw your attention specifically to this one, which is new, the 915. Further molecular testing is recommended due to the method limitations of this laboratory. It's important to use this in your recommendation or in your letter once you have the idea that you might have missed a mutation simply because it doesn't match the hematology, or that you didn't find anything, but still the hematology is indicative of a thalassemia phenotype. Well, ticking all the possibilities is not the idea. So please only select the relevant ones. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them.
Now, I've got one question here from, I just need to adjust my glasses, from Victoria Cloak, who has asked, is there still a relevance in suggesting testing any partners in the context of preconception testing?
So the idea was, if there's antenatal screening, then what's the point of preconception testing?
Yes, in the context of preconception testing, yes.
So, I mean, I would say that it's always good if you know that there's a family history, for example, of hemoglobinopathies, then it would always make sense to do preconception testing if you know that you're specifically at higher risk than the population, because it just provides more time. So sometimes with antenatal screening, it can be a bit rushed by the time the results come back, and then you test the partner, and then you've got to arrange the prenatal specimen. So yeah, I just think it would always make sense to request preconception testing if you know that there are mutations in your family members.
Thank you.
My view anyway.
Yes.
Yes, I think, well, I agree completely with this standpoint. In the Netherlands, we don't have an antenatal screening like in the UK. So this is not, it is not the case that every pregnant will be checked for a thalassemia or sickle cell carriership. So this means that, well, a pre-conceptional screening would be an easy thing to do for the GP when they are in a close relationship with the patients. On the other hand, there's of course a fear that there will be tested too much. So I think a family anamnesis or family history is very important in this respect in order to say yes, let's do preconceptional screening. But so it's not really screening; it is more preconceptional testing. In the case of a positive family history, there could also be a reason to test when there isn't the ethnicity is indicative of coming from a high risk era, so at high risk for hemoglobinopathies.
I am presuming, however, and I mean, I don't obviously deal with this, you know, I'm an EQA provider, but presumably, even if there is preconception testing, in the event that the patient or the antenatal, I always dislike calling antenatal people patients because they're not really sick, but you know, an antenatal client is then tested post-conception, that they will follow up with the, you know, request testing of the baby's biological father, because I suppose the worry always is that the preconception partner testing may not be the same as the person concerned may not be the baby's biological father, although that's going to be a very, very difficult conversation with those responsible for the counselling, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that it's sort of set out is that even if you've had testing before, you would be retested in every pregnancy for antenatal screening.
Yes.
So even if you've had, well, I don't know if they still do it if you've had genetic testing, but if you just had a screening result that says you're a beta thal carrier, you'd be retested, and I think the partner would be if they're happy to be retested. Sometimes the partners aren't always as cooperative as you might hope, but
no. Thank you. There's no other open questions at the moment. I was just have a couple of questions here. Bashori, in terms of the recommendations, we have UK NEQAS has obviously updated the recommendations recently, the choice of recommendations, and we would ask any participants, if you have any feedback, you know, on those, please let us know. We do try to keep the list of recommendations or the choice of recommendations fairly short, just simply because it allows us then to give a better summary of the back to you of what people would recommend. Otherwise we have, you know, 50 participants and you will end up with 50 different recommendations, which in many respects becomes meaningless. It's good to try and push those down to the same classifications as we can. So is there any restriction on the number of recommendations that people can submit for any case? You know, what is to stop people ticking every single box?
Yeah, we have changed it now. So the website that we've gone live with, we've limited it to 3 recommendations that you can select and submit. And I think within that, I can't remember whether it's on the same page or not, but you know, if anyone is keen to add any further comment alongside their recommendations, or you know, had an extra recommendation that they couldn't fit in, there is a comments box, a free text, either for miscellaneous comments, or it might be on the same page as the recommendations, to add any extra you know, comments if they want to. But yeah, I mean, we did feel to, you know, in the previous format, which was the Microsoft Word document results pro forma that used to be used, you know, we did have a select number of boxes, but obviously it was possible to just put all 9 recommendations if you wanted to. So nobody ever did, obviously, but it just, you know, even if you select up to 6 recommendations, it can be a bit much, and you know, it's probably not realistic as to what you would do with a patient report. So we're just, you know, we've tried to limit it for that reason, but also, you know, as Barbara mentioned, it helps us with the scoring side of things as well, and capturing that data to see how many people you know, selected which recommendation, and keep a limit on it that way. So yes, so currently there is now a limit of 3 recommendations that you can select from.
But we're not giving people adverse marks if they pick a wrong recommendation, but we might mention that in comments. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think generally we are focusing on scoring the you know, I mean, yeah, in terms of how we score the recommendations, we do try to, when we're writing the model answer, for example, select the recommendations that we feel are accurate and required, and any extra recommendations that may be made, you know, we'll take on board during the you know, when we look at the submission, and take it on board. But unless it's wildly inaccurate or could lead to potentially dangerous consequences, we wouldn't necessarily give it an adverse score. So an example would be if you said no further action required for a case that clearly should have further actions, like further testing, or you know, partner testing should have been, baby's biological father testing should have been recommended, things like that. But yeah, so generally we try to you know, we don't adversely score the recommendations unless it seems appropriate to.
Okay, that's lovely, thank you. The other question that I have, because I know sometimes we discuss this during marking, is with, you know, perhaps more to Dr. Harteveld, is in terms of the terminology and the nomenclature, why do you think, from a clinical point of view, it is important to get these correct in the reports and the letters that might go out to a clinician were these patient samples?
Well, I think it's important to get that correct, because sometimes the request comes from a molecular geneticist, and another it comes from a hematologist, and then it comes from a clinical chemist. And if you limit yourself to, let's say, saying the molecular mutation and mention that and nothing else, then it is not a hemoglobinopathy assessment. Then it is a DNA assessment, and then you should go to EMQN or NEQAS or wherever. I think it's important in this assessment that you have knowledge about the hemoglobinopathies, and that you know what the consequences are of that particular mutation. For instance, there are certain mutations which are clearly giving a different kind of phenotype. For instance, the codon 39 is quite straightforward. If you are homozygous for that, okay, you are transfusion dependent. But there are also ones like the IVS 110, which is considered beta plus, has a residual expression which is very, very low. It's only 5%. So if you are homozygous for that, you don't have a mild intermedia, which you might expect from a homozygous beta plus. No, you are transfusion dependent. IVS 110 is one of the, well, worst ones in the Mediterranean area. And on the other hand, if you take the codon 8 minus AA, which is a very common, well, it's not so common, it's quite rare, but it is present in Turkey. If you are heterozygous or homozygous for that one, you actually have a relatively high F expression. So even though it's a frameshift variant, which is beta 0 tau, and you're homozygous for it, still you have a somewhat milder phenotype, which of course will need transfusions, but it is much milder in childhood. So I think it is important to know about the phenotype which goes with the particular mutations.
That's lovely, thank you. So we have no further questions. I've just got one comment that we do see sometimes is, and I would always encourage participants to upload a copy of their report or you know, the report that will in the format that it will be sent back to the clinician. I realise this can be difficult at times because we do have a number of different languages that are used, and regretfully, like most English people, I can really only speak English and a little bit of French, so I'm afraid it's I am limited. However, we do sometimes see a contradiction. We do very carefully look at the reports, because sometimes just to see whether we can find more clarification on how it would be reported, and to see that we can actually understand that there would be a correct clinical report going out to the requesting clinician where our sample is actually a patient sample. We do sometimes see a contradiction between what is written in the report and what is entered on our data entry forms or our data entry website. We do try to give participants the benefit of the doubt there, and to see where we can actually understand that the participant actually does understand what they are trying to report back to the clinician. However, if we really cannot establish which is the correct one, I would say that we do whatever has been entered on our data entry site does take precedence if we cannot elucidate it and decide between the two. This is simply because we have to have one situation where we decide something is right. So I would, number one, urge people to upload the copy of their report, and number two, urge people just to make sure there's no contradiction between the report and what they have entered on our data entry website, because if we cannot clarify between the two, we will go with what is on the data entry website, simply because we have to take one answer as the truth, as it were. And I do just notice that somebody has just popped a question into the chat. We do ask people to put it in the Q&A, but I can actually look at this, and the question is, I'm sorry, I can't, with the format on my screen, I can't actually see the individual's name. Oh, I've got it come up here now. It's from Salle Papasava. Apologies if I haven't pronounced that correctly. It says, regarding the interpretation of the cases, why is homozygous beta thalassemia or affected with beta thalassemia insufficient? The participant has asked, I was under the impression that beta zero or thalassemia major are obsolete terms since there is a variability in the phenotype. And I don't know whether Dr. Harteveld or Dr. Proben, which of you would like to answer that?
Well, I think it's important to be as specific as possible, but I understand what you say, because indeed the variability in clinical expression is quite different, even with the same genotype in the same families. The severity of the clinical severity could be different. So I agree. So in principle, you expect, well, homozygous beta thalassemia, okay, that is quite correct, I think, because it indicates that either the patient is, depending on the mutation, likely to be beta thalassemia major or intermedia. You say you think these terms are obsolete. I don't know. Personally, I would say it's important to mention the expected severity. And as far as affected with beta thalassemia, well, I have to admit, if I report this to a Dutch hematologist, he will say that even a carrier will be affected because he sees a microcytic hyperchromia and an anemia which he can't explain. And that's not really what the message is. So that is it's probably terminology, but I think affected, well, that should be interpreted as ill from or having a clinical significant expression of the disease. So in that case, I would say affected should be okay, but to be as specific as possible is, I think, will contribute to how that it will be interpreted in one way and not in several ways. I don't know what Melanie thinks about this.
So, yeah, I know that some people have moved towards using transfusion dependent or not non-transfusion dependent beta thalassemia, for example. I guess that's still not differentiating between the carrier or trait phenotype. But you kind of, well, I don't know. I'd like to think most of the time you'd say carrier or trait if you were talking about a mild, outcome, wouldn't you, normally? So, but yeah, I agree that there is a bit of blurring of boundaries sometimes, isn't there, in the way that these can be reported, and like you say, the phenotypic outcomes vary. So sometimes, like for example, if I had a result that was a homozygous beta 0, but the person had high F but wasn't that anemic, I wouldn't say they had a diagnosis of beta thalassemia major, because there's kind of a clinical diagnosis to make in some ways, isn't it? So if it was a baby, you could say they would be predicted to be affected with it in the future, but if the clinical details in an older person don't match up, then because of all the genetic modifiers, etc., I think you can't say someone's got beta thalassemia major if it looks like actually they're not transfusion dependent.
Thank you. I think it highlights the extreme variability that there is in the haemoglobinopathies, and why it's so important that we look beyond just finding the right genetic mutation, and we look entirely at the entire case and try to take the whole clinical picture into consideration. We are just about out of time now, so if there are no further questions or our panelists have nothing else they wish to add, I will, and there's no last minute questions from our delegates, I will bring the webinar to a close and thank both, first of all, our speakers, and also to all of our delegates for joining us today. I would also like to thank you for your interest and your continued support of the programme.